In the late summer of 1864, the United States of America was a nation on the verge of collapse, not from a Confederate army, but from within. The Civil War was dragging into its fourth bloody year, and the Northern public was exhausted. It was a presidential election year, and Abraham Lincoln, the man who had prosecuted this brutal conflict, was facing political annihilation. His own chances of re-election looked, in his own words, exceedingly poor. The Confederacy knew this. They had one final, viable strategy: not to win, but to not lose. Their entire plan for 1864 was to hold on. In Virginia, General Robert E. Lee had to hold back Ulysses S. Grant's army from the Confederate capital of Richmond. And in Georgia, General Joseph E. Johnston had to keep General William Tecumseh Sherman's Union forces from capturing the Confederacy's second most important city, Atlanta. If Lee and Johnston could just hold their ground until the November election, the war-weary North would likely vote Lincoln out of office. His Democratic opponent would almost certainly sue for peace, and the Confederacy would win its independence. The fate of the entire war, the very existence of the United States, rested on these two fronts. In Georgia, General William T. Sherman commanded a massive army group of over 100,000 men. Facing him was Joseph E. Johnston, a brilliant and cautious commander with perhaps 60,000. As Sherman advanced from Tennessee, Johnston executed a masterful policy of strategic retreat. He refused to fight Sherman on Sherman's terms. He would fight small, defensive battles, inflict casualties, and then fall back, preserving his own army. He was trading territory for time. And time was the one thing the Confederacy needed to win the war. But in Richmond, Confederate President Jefferson Davis was watching, and he did not understand. He saw Johnston's cautious tactics not as strategy, but as cowardice. He was out of patience. And in July of 1864, just as Sherman was closing in on Atlanta, Davis made one of the most catastrophic, politically motivated military decisions of the entire war. He panicked. He fired the one general who was successfully executing the Confederacy's only winning strategy. In Johnston's place, Davis appointed General John Bell Hood. Hood was everything Johnston was not. He was famously aggressive, reckless, and beloved by Davis for his promise to attack. And attack he did. Hood immediately launched a series of desperate, bloody, frontal assaults to break Sherman's siege. He threw his army at the Union lines at the Battle of Peachtree Creek. He attacked again at the Battle of Atlanta. He attacked a third time at the Battle of Ezra Church. Each attack was a disaster. Each one failed, and in just a few short weeks, Hood's army was crippled. He had bled his forces white for no strategic gain. On September 1st, 1864, John Bell Hood, his army shattered, had no choice. He evacuated Atlanta, burning his own military supplies as he left. The next day, Sherman's troops marched in. The news of Atlanta's fall flashed across the telegraph wires to the north like a bolt of lightning. It was the victory the Union desperately needed. Public confidence in the war was restored overnight. In November, Abraham Lincoln was re-elected in a landslide. The Confederacy's win by not losing strategy was dead. The fall of Atlanta had not only sealed their political fate, it had set the stage for the final, brutal act of the war. The first great panic of the campaign had not been Sherman's. It had been Jefferson Davis's, and it had cost him the war. But for General Sherman, the capture of Atlanta was not an end. It was the beginning of a terrifying new problem. Sherman was now deep in the heart of the Confederacy. His army was supplied by a single, thin, and impossibly long railroad line that snaked hundreds of miles back to Chattanooga, Tennessee. It was his lifeline, and it was completely vulnerable. General Hood, though defeated, was not destroyed, and now he made a desperate gamble. Instead of retreating south, deeper into Georgia, Hood marched his entire army north, back toward Tennessee. His plan was conventional, but clever. He would attack Sherman's supply line. He would force Sherman to abandon Atlanta and chase him back north, giving up all the hard-won ground. Sherman briefly pursued Hood, but he quickly realized this was a fool's errand. And in this moment of crisis, Sherman conceived one of the most radical, audacious, and terrifying plans in military history. He would let Hood go. He realized Hood's army was no longer the objective. It was an irrelevance. In a moment of strategic jujitsu, Sherman saw that his enemy's greatest threat was actually his greatest opportunity. "If he will go to the Ohio River," Sherman famously remarked, "I'll give him rations." Here was the plan. He would split his army in two. He would detach a large force under his reliable subordinate, General George H. Thomas, and send him to Tennessee to contain and destroy Hood. And then Sherman would do the unthinkable. He would take his 62,000 best, veteran troops, turn his back on the enemy army, and cut his own supply lines. He would sever all communication with the North, light a torch to his base in Atlanta, and march 300 miles south, across the heart of Georgia, to the Atlantic Ocean. He would live off the land. This was not a whim. It was the culmination of a philosophy Sherman had been developing for years, in campaigns like Vicksburg and Meridian. Sherman, a man who personally hated the idea of having to kill and maim Confederates, believed that the conventional, bloody, grinding war of attrition was not just brutal, but inefficient. He believed this new, hard war would actually shorten the conflict and, in the end, save lives. This was the core of his thesis. He would not target Confederate armies. He would target the Confederate will. He would, in his own words, prove to the Confederate population that its government could not protect the people from invaders. He would wage a war on their psychology. This, he said, may not be war, but rather statesmanship. He would destroy their ability to wage war, their railroads, their factories, their farms, and in doing so he would destroy their will to continue. In Washington, the plan was met with abject terror. President Lincoln was anxious, if not fearful. General-in-Chief Ulysses S. Grant had serious reservations. Grant's own chief of staff was so opposed that, when he couldn't change Grant's mind, he appealed to the authorities at Washington to stop it. But Grant had a unique and total trust in Sherman. He had seen his genius at Vicksburg. In the end, Grant made the call. On November 2nd, 1864, he sent Sherman a simple, famous telegram. "Go as you propose." The march was on. On November 15th, 1864, Sherman gave the order. His engineers began the systematic destruction of Atlanta's military and industrial infrastructure. The railroad depots, the factories, the machine shops. Anything that could be used to support the Confederate war effort was leveled and set ablaze. This was the fire that entered myth. It was not, as legend has it, the entire city. Only about 40% of Atlanta burned. But it was a signal, a pillar of smoke that announced the beginning of the campaign. Then, the army moved out. And this was no mob. It was a finely tuned, 62,000-man engine of destruction. It was divided into two massive wings. The right wing, the Army of the Tennessee, was commanded by Major General Oliver O. Howard. The left wing, the Army of Georgia, was commanded by Major General Henry W. Slocum. These two wings did not march in a single column. They spread out, moving in 4 parallel corps, creating a corridor of destruction, 50 to 60 miles wide, nearly 100 kilometers, as they scythed their way southeast. Before leaving, Sherman had issued his Special Field Orders number, 120. These were the rules of engagement. The orders were explicit. The army would forage liberally on the country. Each brigade was to organize an official, good and sufficient foraging party, under the command of a discreet officer. But the orders also contained crucial limitations. Soldiers were explicitly forbidden from entering the dwellings of the inhabitants, and the officers were ordered to discriminate between the rich, who were often the wealthy slaveholders who had pushed for secession, and the poor, who were often just trying to survive. That was the rule. The reality was far more chaotic. The official Disciplined foraging parties were soon joined by a vast, unauthorized ecosystem of stragglers, looters, and camp followers. They became known as bummers. These were the men who created the true terror. They were the ones who committed the acts of pillage, robbery, and violence that Sherman himself later acknowledged. They were the ones who would ransack a plantation, discover hidden silver, and terrify the civilian population. This dual system was Sherman's unstated masterstroke. The official foraging parties were the logisticians. They fed the army. The unofficial bummers were the agents of psychological terror. They were the ones who proved that no one was safe. And it was this unpredictability that created a profound, soul-crushing panic. This was not a random rampage. It was a data-driven operation. Before the march, Sherman had carefully studied census records. He used data from the 1860 United States Census to plot his route precisely through Georgia's wealthiest and most fertile agricultural lands. He knew exactly where the corn, the cattle, and the supplies were hidden. This was, in the words of one historian, a marvel of military engineering and logistics, and all of it was supported by a plan. Quartermaster General Meigs in Washington was already stockpiling 30,000 coats, 60,000 shirts, and 100,000 pairs of shoes on the coast at Hilton Head, anticipating the army's arrival. The primary targets were the infrastructure of war. First, communications. The soldiers cut every telegraph line they found, plunging the entire state into an information black hole. Second, industry. They destroyed military targets as well as industry, infrastructure, and civilian property. This meant cotton gins, flour mills, factories, warehouses, and depots were all put to the torch. And third, most famously, the railroads. This was the circulatory system of the Confederacy, and Sherman's men tore it apart with systematic, practiced efficiency. Here is how they did it. A line of soldiers would stand on one side of a track. At a command, they would lift the rail and the wooden ties all at once, flipping the entire section over. They would then pry the rails from the ties. They stacked the ties into massive bonfires and laid the iron rails on top. When the rails glowed red-hot in the fire, they would grab them and twist them around the trunks of trees or bend them into grotesque, useless shapes. These became known as Sherman's neckties. They were a symbol of the South's total vulnerability. The destruction was so complete that Sherman later estimated the damage at $100 million, an astronomical sum for 1864. With the telegraph lines cut, general panic and wild rumors spread through the civilian population. The state was panic-stricken. We can read the terror in their own words. The diary of Carrie Berry, a young girl in Atlanta, captured the feeling as the army left. Soldiers were going around setting houses on fire. They behaved very badly. Nobody know what we have suffered since they came in. Minerva McClatchy, near Marietta, wrote of the plight of refugees returning to their destroyed homes. One Union soldier, marching through the untouched heartland, wrote in his own journal, "This part of Georgia had never realized what war was until we came through. And who was there to stop this 62,000-man juggernaut? The Confederate opposition was, in a word, meager. General John Bell Hood and the main Confederate army were hundreds of miles away in Tennessee, engaged in their own futile campaign. The defense of Georgia was left to Lieutenant General William J. Hardee. His army consisted of two parts. First, the cavalry corps of Major General Joseph Wheeler, a force of somewhere between 3,500 and 10,000 troopers. Wheeler's men were a constant annoyance, harassing Sherman's flanks, but they were too small to stop him. The second part was the Georgia State Militia, under General Gustavus W. Smith. This was the last line of defense. It was a force of about 3,050 soldiers, most of whom were boys and elderly men. The ultimate symbol of this Confederate panic happened at the state capital, Milledgeville. When Governor Joseph E. Brown heard that Sherman's army was heading his way, he was consumed by panic. He ordered the governor's mansion stripped of all of its furnishings and possessions, which were loaded onto trains and sent south. He went to the state penitentiary and released 150 prisoners, offering them a pardon if they would just help defend the capital. And then, Governor Brown and the entire Georgia state legislature fled the city. On November 23rd, the Union's left wing marched into Milledgeville unopposed. They walked into the vacant Capitol building, and then, in an act of supreme political humiliation, the Union officers held a mock legislative session in the abandoned State House. They drunkenly debated, and then, with great ceremony, voted to repeal Georgia's Ordinance of Secession. Sherman himself arrived and, finding the governor's mansion completely empty, slept on the floor. This was the physical proof of Sherman's core idea. The Confederate government had utterly and publicly failed in its most basic duty. It could not protect the people. The social contract between the people of Georgia and the Confederacy was irrevocably broken.